On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the Secretary of the Navy is talking about a renaissance in maritime statecraft. We better call Sal. I'm the aforementioned Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, Secretary of the Navy Del Toro went up to Harvard, talked to the Kennedy School about this new concept of maritime statecraft. Been getting a lot of attention out there. Recent book by Brent Sadler, a lot of editorials, articles, papers, and not the least of which coming from me and John Conrad over at G Captain. And it looks like the Secretary of the Navy, Del Toro, is listening to someone. Maybe not me, maybe not John, but he's listening to somebody. And I want to go ahead and critique this video. I haven't done a Better Call Sal video in a while. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come in. All right, Better Call Sal. All right, we're going to take a listen to this video. It's a bit of a long video, and I'm going to edit out parts of it. And I actually started about 12 minutes in. He was given a brief introduction, and he gets into the heart of the matter right here.
And that is why I stand before you today to call for a new vision of maritime statecraft to address the challenges that our nation faces in the 21st century. Your nation calls you, once again, our best and brightest strategic thinkers at the intersection of academia and policymaking to help us build our maritime statecraft of the future.
So that's an interesting call to arms. You're at the Kennedy School. This is something John F. Kennedy did when he was president during the height of the Cold War. And we see Del Toro doing the same thing here.
Allow me to now explain why such an endeavor is actually necessary and to share what we are doing about it right now, moving forward into the future. And as you are already aware, the People's Republic of China is building up its naval fleet at a rapid pace. In the 20 years since I left active duty, the PLA Navy has tripled in size, is on pace to have over 400 naval warships by 2030.
So Del Toro was a Navy captain, and his statement about the PLA, this is the People's Liberation Army's Navy, I know it's confusing, but that's what the Chinese Navy is referred to, is on an amazing pace. Go back to 2000, it was a coastal fleet of very small vessels. Today, it is a blue water fleet. A lot of people want to degrade the Chinese Navy and say that they are not a deep water fleet. You just need to really seriously take a look at what they're doing. Look at what the Navy War College, China Maritime Studies Institute is doing. Look at that Navy. It is growing quickly in terms of destroyers, cruisers, even aircraft carriers, submarines. They are starting to become a major threat on the world's oceans, a true blue water entity. And this is what the U.S. has to face. I'm not saying they're the equal of the United States right now, but they are an emerging one.
I must also underscore to you, because it is far less widely understood, that the growth of the PRC's commercial maritime power is a development more concerning even than its naval expansion.
Thank you. Been talking about this forever. Understand, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. commercial industry bifurcated at the end of the Cold War. There was a schism, a chasm, I don't know what you want to call it, but they cleaved apart from each other. The U.S. Navy believed that it can make do with its own private commercial merchant marine, what became known as the Military Sea Transportation Service, later the Military Sea Lift Command. And that was the track they followed for about 30 years, up until the end of the Vietnam War into the 1980s. And then the Navy and the Department of Defense went even further and oversaw this maritime strategy that really focused on naval strategy without really looking at the commercial side. And what happened is the U.S. merchant marine and the U.S. maritime industry just withered away. There was very little support from the DoD. And I'm not talking about financial support. I'm talking about vocal support for it. And what we saw was the U.S. Navy excelled to be the most powerful Navy in the world, while the U.S. merchant marine just bottomed out. Meanwhile, China is growing both the Navy and the commercial side equally.
Our nation's most prominent naval strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, argued that naval power begets maritime commercial power.
Talk about Mahan. Have to take a drink. It's the rule.
And control of maritime commerce begets greater naval power. And that is as true today as it was in the days of Mahan. Today's PRC leadership has read and studied Mahan's theory, and perhaps even better than we have. and their actions actually show it over the past 40 years. PRC today is the world's largest builder of commercial ocean-going ships, with over 40% of the global market being built in Chinese shipyards.
The latest review of maritime transport, which I just did a video on, has them at 44%. There is one Chinese building corporation, the Chinese shipbuilding, Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation, builds 20% of the world's ships, not just China's ship, but 20% of the world's ships.
More concerning still, Beijing leverages its dominant commercial shipbuilding capacity in modern commercial shipyards and infrastructure to more efficiently produce its naval combatants as well.
I don't know how we lost that lesson. I really don't. Because if you look at pre-World War II, the shipyards that build the two ocean navy are building commercial vessels. That's what they're there for. That's what they do. But over the period of time in the Cold War, particularly from the 80s onward, shipyards in the United States became sole source customers for the U.S. Navy. The Navy was the only customer they had, and therefore they became inefficient in many ways, or inefficient in many ways. Whereas in China, you look at a shipyard in China, they're building container ships, they're building tankers, they're building cruise ships, they're building LNG tankers, and then scattered among them are destroyers and frigates and submarines and aircraft carriers.
You cannot have one without the other. Chinese shipping firms have come to dominate the worldwide commercial shipping industry. They've established an ownership stake in 95 ports across 53 countries worldwide, including in many of our own ports here in the United States, and those of our allies, of course. They have a virtual monopoly over the global shipping container and the ship-to-shore crane market.
Absolutely true. We've done videos on this where we talk about the dominance of China, not just building containers, but leasing containers, ZPMC cranes. China has an element there. And one thing he's not talking about is the growth of Chinese merchant mariners. The Chinese mariners are growing in numbers, getting to a point where they're going to eventually rival the Philippines for having more mariners afloat than any other country.
The PRC, through their fleet of cable ships, is also increasing its competition with U.S. tech companies for control over the very seabed cables that carry 95% of global communications worldwide.
Telecommunications, since the 1860s, we've relied on submarine cables to transmit information around the world. Your cell phone, you may think your cell phone is completely wireless, and if you call somebody another continent away, it's wireless. It's not. You are just wireless to a cell phone tower, and that cell phone tower is hooked by a string, a fiber optic cable, to another cable across the oceans and relays that information. And those undersea cables, which relay that information, are extremely important. They're also extremely vulnerable to attack. I mean, the British fished up the German cables at the beginning of World War I and cut them. And you can expect that to happen again in time of war. Look what recently happened to the island of Tonga when its fiber optic cable was severed due to an underwater volcanic eruption. Cut the entire island off.
Seabed power cables that increasingly connect the electric grid to overseas or offshore renewable energy sources also are vulnerable. PRC possesses the world's largest global fishing fleet and the third largest merchant marine fleet, with more than 7,000 ships, compared to the United States, which is ranked 70th with 178 ships.
So that's an interesting measurement. If you look at review of maritime transport, which looks at inland waterways, ships over 100 gross tons, the U.S. ranks 21st in that measurement. China, if you add China and Hong Kong together, they do come in third place now. They've just been eclipsed by Liberia and Panama at first and second place.
Today, less than 0.5% of U.S. international exports and imports sail on U.S. flag merchant ships, almost all of which, quite frankly, are also foreign built.
A lot of that can be fixed too through cargo preference and requirements to ship on American flag vessels, and also providing discounts and rebates and incentives to ship on American ships.
As you can see, The PRC controls much of the global commercial maritime supply chain. This creates real operational and economic risk for the American economy in the event of a crisis or a conflict.
So we saw in the global supply chain crisis that it only took a fluctuation of a few percentage points to cause havoc throughout the system. And the problem is because our supply chain system is so interconnected, when you create a bubble or a ripple in it, it moves down the entire system. What you need is a web. A web allows, one strand to be severed, but there are multiple other strands. The problem is we're a chain, and as with a chain, the weakest link is the problem you have.
And over the past 30 years, while China's comprehensive maritime power has grown exponentially, ours has declined precipitously. History proves that in the long run, there has never been a great naval power that wasn't also a maritime power.
So that's a term, it's actually a specific term for that called thessalocracy. And thessalocracies, if you look through history, you can see him. Clark Reynolds writes a great book about this, where he talks about thessalocracies, Athens and the Italian states and the British and the Phoenicians. You see that kind of merging of power together where there's both military and commercial. That's what you need hand in hand. And that's what Alfred Thayer Mahan talks about in his book. It's the key thing. And it's the Chinese are reading that book. Whew. Going to be a little bit of a wash here on Mahan.
A commercial shipbuilding and a global shipbuilding power. So, that said, I'm an eternal optimist. I really am. There are steps that we are taking today and can take in the future as a nation to revitalize our own maritime strategy here in the United States.
So really happy to hear him say that, actually, because for a lot of times when you hear secretaries of the Navy and defense officials talk, it's pretty much status quo, I would argue. You don't have a lot of new ideas that come out. And it seems as like Del Toro is attempting just that, to create a new concept here.
And such efforts do align with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's strategy to more deeply integrate domestic and foreign policy by reshoring critical strategic industries. The maritime industry is a strategic sector of our economy.
Really happy to hear him say that again. I do believe the maritime sector is absolutely strategic. There are a lot of people who target the maritime sector. I'm talking to you, my buddy Zacato, who target it and don't understand the national security implications of a cut further in the U.S. domestic and foreign trade shipping sectors, both in shipbuilding, ship operations, ship maintenance. We need reform. We need changes, but there are national security implications here.
Critical to the economic and to national security of America. It is vital to achieving resilient global supply chains, and it is ripe with opportunity to partner with a greater number of shipbuilders here in the United States and with our closest allies overseas, including Japan and South Korea, if the economic conditions are appropriate. It also requires urgent U.S. public investment in international statecraft to attract the necessary private capital that will be needed. And we in the Biden administration are leading efforts to grow our nation's strategic advantage at sea in every way possible.
Okay, that sounds good. I'd like to see some proof of that. For example, the massive infrastructure bill that was passed by the Biden administration, a fraction of that is heading anywhere into the maritime sector. Very little of that is doing that. We need to see more of that on the commercial side.
The generational AUKUS security agreement between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom is indeed changing the geostrategic landscape in the Indo-Pacific today. This agreement is more than just an acquisition arrangement for nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines for Australia. It is also a model for how we are expanding naval diplomacy to the procurement and technology development spheres at a scale never seen before. It's driving significant investments across all three nations' defense industrial base.
So AUKUS, this American, U.S., UK agreement, this is what's going to lead to the construction of Virginia class nuclear submarines in Australia. Really innovative idea. You're going to see boats built here in the United States first and then eventually in Australia. We can be doing this in a variety of different areas. I would argue one of the areas we should be looking at is in icebreakers. U.S. desperately needs icebreakers to get up into the Arctic and operate. We're running Coast Guard icebreakers right now that are just abhorrently dangerous. Yet right now, Finland just came into NATO. Finland is one of the top ice-breaking builders in the world. Why don't we make an agreement? Why don't we make the American Baltic Boat Building Agreement, ABBA, trademark pending? Why don't we make ABBA so that we can make an agreement to start building a icebreaker or two up in Finland, and then we bring that technology over to a U.S. yard in conjunction with a Finnish company to build those vessels here. ABBA, coming to you soon.
Equally important is our administration's continued commitment to improving our own naval shipbuilding and repair industry, both public and commercial, with historically high investments through the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Plan and in the industrial base.
Okay, they need to show a better deal with that. You just had a previous CNO who just left office, who is focused on the shipyards and blame the shipyards for lack of capacity. Shipyards will not develop capacity unless you invest in them. They are not going to build up a capacity and then hope the business comes to them. That's not the way it's going to work. At the same time, there's calls for we need more shipbuilding and ship repair capacities. You just had a recent story where BAE in San Diego is laying off hundreds of employees because they can't get any repair facility or any repair contracts in San Diego, a major Pacific base. So we really need to clear this message up and put put actions where our words are.
SIAP alone, we're investing nearly $20 billion over the next 20 years. We must work with our allies to attract the most advanced shipbuilders in the world, to open U.S.-owned subsidiaries and invest in commercial shipyards here in the U.S., modernizing and expanding our shipbuilding industrial capacity and creating a healthier, more competitive shipbuilding workforce.
So this is the call to bring Japanese, Korean shipyards into the United States. The problem is going to be is then you have to adapt to Japanese and Korean shipyard practices and understand Korean shipyards, just to use the example here, one of the problems you have with U.S. shipyards being sole source to the Navy is the Navy will send the ship in and delay its arrival. They'll change the scope of the work order, and that causes a domino effect down the entire down the entire repair chain for the next ship and the ship after that. Korea, you don't do it. You show up on the day you're supposed to be repaired. You have a list that's approved beforehand. That's what's getting fixed. If you need something else, that goes to the back of the line because ship number 2 is waiting to come in. So you got to be careful about what we do in terms of bringing this together. But there is great innovation that could be brought in by bringing Korean, Japanese shipyards in. Same thing like I talked about with the Finnish yard. But also remember, we did this with Australia with Austal down in Mobile, brought in some great technology from the Australians for the building of high-speed ferries, the EPFs, for the construction of the LCS, the Independence class. So we have been doing this to a certain extent, but we've just seen some issues with Austal USA down in Mobile. So we've got to be careful about this.
We, as the Navy and Marine Corps, are a catalyst and key stakeholder in a first of its kind, whole of government effort that reflects the Biden administration's commitment to meeting this challenge. Of course, our maritime statecraft demands even more engagement with our allies and partners. It's critical. I've invested so much of my first 2 years as Secretary of the Navy to just this. Mutually respectful cooperation with them in every domain is at the forefront of our nation's approach to naval diplomacy and at the heart of our national defense strategy. In contrast, China seeks to exploit its growing economic and military power to coerce its neighbors and threaten their interests while undermining our alliances and security partnerships around the globe.
This is Belt and Road. China has been getting inroads to secure the import of material, raw material in particularly, to feed the Chinese economy. They protect their trade routes. They develop multiple different trade routes. Should one collapse, they have the other one to fall in on. It's redundancy after redundancy after redundancy. Again, it's checkers versus, three-dimensional chess. That's what the Chinese tend to do in Belt and Road. And they're extracting agreements, 99-year leases, kind of the flip side of the Treaty of Nanking that the British imposed on them at the end of the Opium Wars. The Chinese are doing that to a lot of countries around the planet. We've got to get better at that element of statesmancraft that looks at natural resources and trade. That means more funding, by the way, for the State Department and closer dialogue with the State Department, Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, all those elements that look at look at trade.
Yet China's Navy is just one piece of the maritime force that Beijing employs to advance its aggressive foreign policy, challenging the rules-based international order that has kept all of our nations thriving for the past 80 years. China's Navy, working alongside China's Coast Guard and maritime militia, is increasingly conducting operations designed to force nations to submit to Beijing's excessive territorial claims.
Chinese Coast Guard is massive in size. I mean, you look at some of the vessels in the Coast Guard, they're bigger than Navy vessels. They use the Coast Guard as a law enforcement entity, much like we do. We need a bigger presence of our Coast Guard. Our Coast Guard shouldn't be just off the coast. It should be operating in international waters, enforcing things like UNCLOS, which, by the way, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the U.S. should ratify. We should ratify it finally and use our Coast Guard as a means of enforcement for it. That means more national security cutters, getting the offshore, the new offshore cutters in service, the ones being built down at Austell in Eastern Shipbuilding, get them in those offshore patrol vessels or craft in service as soon as we can to supplement the fact that we have 50, 60-year-old Coast Guard cutters out there.
Some of which have been challenged and ruled illegal by the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague.
Doesn't help when we're not a member on
Using these gray
clause.
zone operations, the PRC is staking illegal maritime claims to offshore resources that threaten the peace, prosperity, and ecological stability of the world's oceans and the very economic existence of many of these small countries that can't defend themselves in any other way. For years, it has threatened Southeast Asian countries for daring to pursue energy development in their own internationally recognized EEZs.
This is China challenging Vietnam and the Philippines in particularly.
In 2020, when China embarked on a concerted effort to intimidate Malaysia out of its rightful offshore resources, the U.S. 7th Fleet's Task Force 76 began a remarkable prototype operation, pioneering a new approach to support our partners' civilian vessels and standing up to China's coercive maritime insurgency in the South China Sea. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps units from several ship classes took part, including a littoral combat ship, a destroyer, a cruiser, and a large deck amphibious assault ship, the USS America, with its full complement of Marines on board. Joining forces with a frigate from the Royal Australian Navy, Task Force 76 established and maintained a persistent presence in determining support of a partner's sovereign internationally recognized rights. And guess what happened? China backed down.
This period of time, Malaysia was developing a new oil region, and so they had platforms in there, and the Chinese were harassing the platforms.
As Task Force 76's commander, Rear Admiral Fred Kacher, who I will also note is a graduate of the Kennedy School, and also my nominee today to be the next 7th Fleet commander. As he observed at the time, this combination of U.S. and allied ships highlights the flexibility and agility of our naval forces in this vital region, demonstrating that the wide range of naval capability that we have available in the Indo-Pacific. Now, mind you, Admiral Kacher is currently being held up by the United States Senate from being able to go to the 7th Fleet. He is admirably serving as the acting superintendent of the Naval Academy.
Just had the opportunity to meet him the other day when I was at the McMullen Naval History Symposium.
And doing a great job. Where I really need Admiral Kacher is not in Annapolis, it's in 7th Fleet. And we need the Senate to release its hold on not just my Commandant, my Chief of Naval Operations, they just voted in the Commandant, but on all the other 298 or so nominations that are being held up by the Senate today. I assure you that we continue to seize this strategic opportunity to deepen our cooperation with our allies and partners in the South China Sea. This past summer, the U.S. and Philippine navies conducted a series of exercises and combined operations north of Palawan, as well as a trilateral exercise with Japan, a first for all three navies operating together. Our Marine Corps also continues to partner with the Philippines, working to build the interoperability between our naval forces, in turn strengthening our collective ability to address these shared security concerns.
A lot of presence in the Philippines recently. I was just looking at Navy supply vessels, support vessels. There were 3 of them that were docked in Subic Bay the other day. So definitely using the infrastructure that once existed in the Philippines from the U.S. presence and now trying to rekindle that. There's discussions about more basing in the United States and the Philippines. Problem with the Philippines is going to be the government. Whichever government comes in, are they going to be pro-U.S. or pro-China? Because we've seen different versions of that roll in.
However, the PRC's actions aren't confined to just the Indo-Pacific. Through its distant water fishing fleet, they engage in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing around the world, negatively impacting fragile maritime ecosystems and the economic well-being of those nations and people it exploits. And this is real. How many of you have the Galapagos Islands on your bucket list? Okay. For all of you who have not gone, you better hurry up, because these Chinese fishing fleet are eating up the stocks that the ecosystem on the Galapagos Islands actually depends upon for its very existence.
So China has to haul in a massive amount of protein to feed its population, and a lot of it is through fishing. And understand the fishing rules that are in place under UNCLOS basically prohibit fishing within the 200-mile economic zone of a country. But the Chinese fishing fleet will get right on the edge of a nation's EEZ, in this case, Ecuador, which controls the Galapagos Islands, and they will fish the entire perimeter around it. Now, it is believed, and we know this happens, that the Chinese will send in fishing vessels with their AIS, their transponders turned off, to go in and sweep up fish and bring them out from the inside the EZ. You need constant patrolling. That means aircraft. That means ships. That means satellite. That means people on the water observing them. And a lot of nations do not have that capability because they lack the coast guards and navies to do it. That's why the United States needs to be more forward with deployment of coast guard cutters in support of other nations. Something like this off the coast of Ecuador or of Chile or Peru, we see the fishing fleets of China going into these massive EEZs. It's one of the reasons that Chinese are so big about establishing bases in the South China Sea, because the U.S. and a lot of the Western nations, because of the period of imperialism, hold these little islands out in the Pacific that create massive EEZs. The U.S. EEZ, French, British in the Pacific is substantial. And this creates problems with China. So we need to understand why the Chinese do this. But Chinese overfishing causes disruptions in nations. We've seen it. Somalia, for example, goes to piracy because their waters were heavily polluted, heavily overfished, and that drove the population to have to do something else on the maritime domain, and that was piracy.
And if this keeps up unchecked, it will lead to the disappearance of those species on the Galapagos Islands. As the need to source their global battery and solar panel industry transitions to rare seabed minerals and deep sea mining in the years to come, the PRC will undoubtedly ramp up its illegal exploitation of natural resources belonging to maritime nations throughout the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Now, equally worrisome, there are other adversaries beyond China with designs to disrupt the free flow of commerce in the maritime domain, a domain where 90% of international trade transits. Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative is negatively impacting food security around the world, as Moscow refuses to guarantee the safety of commercial ships sailing in and out of Ukrainian ports.
I can't help but take a moment here to talk about the fact is, why is NATO not up on the Black Sea doing more to safely escort vessels in and around that area and declaring international waters of the Black Sea free of issues, even just minesweepers up on the Black Sea from NATO, would alleviate. We just saw an instance of a ship off the anchorage at Danube getting hit by a mine. Now, the mine was probably a Ukrainian mine that popped loose, but it does create instability in the region. And you're going to hear him talk a little bit about using armed forces in the Persian Gulf, yet we're not doing it on the Black Sea.
Iran continues to interfere with merchant shipping in the Straits of Hormuz through a campaign of harassment and seizures with its paranaval forces. Just today, we have an ARG on station with Marines on station protecting the flow of free commerce to the Straits of Hormuz.
Not exactly sure how much they're protecting because there was a discussion about putting armed detachments on commercial vessels. That has not happened yet. Most of the vessels that go in and out of the Persian Gulf are foreign flag vessels, not U.S. flag vessels. So having them there is a deterrent, is with no doubt about that. But what exactly are they doing? Not 100% sure.
These nefarious actions challenge one of the foundational principles of our nation, the freedom of the seas. And because of our values and commitment to ensuring that the maritime commons are free and open for the benefit of all, we, the United States Navy, are the partner of choice for many fellow maritime nations. And we are seeking out new strategic partnerships as part of our maritime statecraft. Just this past week, I met with over 90 heads of navies at the International Sea Power Symposium in Newport, where we committed to working together. As but one example, we have made deepening our relationship with India a top priority, and we are advancing our cooperation on undersea domain awareness as well as other initiatives to strengthen our naval ties in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere.
There's a recent agreement about defending the EEZs of Palau, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands. And so the U.S. is doing more in that we guarantee that we provide assistance to those nations to enforce their economic zones.
This emerging relationship with India was fostered by the late Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, a brilliant and beloved colleague, a mentor, and a friend to so many of you during his years here at Harvard. While we all miss him dearly, we will forever appreciate his understanding of the critical role that naval diplomacy plays in our changing security landscape. We build these relationships with many nations through traditional engagements, exercises, port calls, but also through new innovative ways such as technology bridges and research sharing agreements and climate assistance as well too, that's so critical to so many of those smaller island nations in the Blue Pacific who are threatened by climate and threatened by the PRC.
When you talk about ocean rise and you're on an island that has the highest point is 21 feet above sea level, yeah, that's going to be a big issue for them.
We commit to seeking out new partners and attending new non-traditional forums to address emerging maritime challenges. The first Secretary of the Navy to serve on the U.S. delegation to our Oceans Conference in Panama this past year, my engagement in that high-level global forum and relationships that we built there reinforced my own conviction that a comprehensive maritime statecraft would open up opportunities for our nations to create even more inclusive coalitions with other nations and other industries around the globe. And as we engage with nations around the world, we focus on communicating three things. One, that we value their partnership with us.
That's a big difference in what China does because China puts their values above everybody else. Now, some will say we do that, but in truth, China really is imposing a lot of conditions on their agreements.
Two, that we will support them in addressing their challenges, not just our challenges, but their challenges.
The problem with that is usually supporting those requires funding, money, resources. And China, being a country that it is able to allocate that in a much better, efficient, and in sometimes larger manner than we can.
And that we will, perhaps this is the most important one, be a trusted, dependable, and durable partner.
I think that's the big selling point right there, is that being an ally of the U.S. comes with a long-term commitment. Now, granted, we have not always been the best of allies, but in truth, are we better than China? I would argue yes.
Trust between nations is what makes the difference. And it's what makes the difference between our relationship with other nations and those of China and Russia. Those are just transactions. We have trusted relationships with these countries. This type of soft power is truly our competitive advantage. Last year, during my trip to geostrategically significant Pacific Islands, a trip that took place shortly after the Chinese foreign minister's charm offensive to entice Pacific Island partners out of our security orbit and into theirs, we reached out to 12 nations across the Blue Pacific to engage them, again, their existential climate threats. They're real. And while our competitor is building illegal artificial islands and militarizing them, our Seabees are in the same region assisting with vital infrastructure in the Pacific and the Southeast Asia. We assured our partners that we can and we will do more. Alongside Secretary John Kerry, I delivered the first of a series of Office of Naval Research climate resilience decision tools that are planned for island leaders. Yes, we are using technology to the best of our advantage to help our fellow partners.
This is not selling everywhere. I mean, you look at the Solomon Islands, for example, where China's made agreements with other areas. We went into Papua New Guinea. In many ways, a lot of the places in the South Pacific that we saw being fought over in World War II are now a diplomatic fight between the U.S. and China.
And I presented the first tool set first to President Whips of Palau. This ONR capability was highlighted at the United Nations General Assembly last week as a leading high-impact innovation for sustainable development. Today, President Biden is meeting with those same nations that we have been engaging with at the Pacific Island Forum Summit in Washington, D.C., to discuss how we can further increase our cooperation with them to address the climate crisis and other common challenges that we face. We're also building new maritime coalitions through the use of unmanned technologies. In the Middle East, our Task Force 59 is creating unique partnerships between nations that haven't worked together before, over 29 of them, demonstrating how unmanned platforms can provide persistent maritime domain awareness in contested waters.
The unmanned platforms are an interesting one. We're seeing the use of a lot of autonomous systems developing in the commercial sector. There's a lot of utility for it in the maritime sector. However, we have tried this before with autonomous systems in the military. They create problems. You go back to the DASH system, this drone anti-submarine helicopter that the U.S. Navy used in the 50s and 60s, Sea Scout, all of these things create problems in some ways, but again, using them for monitoring observation is great. But there is also seems to be a big selling point in the U.S. Navy for the use of these drones to maximize, or I shouldn't say maximize, but to magnify their strike potential. I think we've got to be really careful about those.
Navy is expanding that successful model to the Caribbean just this year at my encouragement to the Chief of Naval Operations, with our Fourth Fleet incorporating unmanned systems to help our allies and partners in addressing a range of their most pressing maritime issues, from narcotics and human trafficking to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Through the incorporation of unmanned platforms into their fleet, they will be empowered to shine a light on illicit exploitation of their sovereign waters to direct enforcement actions with manned assets. And as our partners and allies leverage these unmanned performances and platforms to cue their manned assets, our Coast Guard is also actively engaging them. Over the past year, our United States Coast Guard has been given authorization by Pacific Island governments in Palau, Micronesia, and Papua New Guinea to enforce maritime law and their EEZs to counter PRC incursions.
So that's talking about stationing U.S. Coast Guard in those countries and having the police power to enforce the EEZs within those countries. In the past, you have to have agreements. You have to have somebody from those nations on board. It's a little bit of a mechanism you have to go through. But again, this creates a much bigger footprint. And understand, Palau, Micronesia, and Papua New Guinea, those are massive EEZs across the Pacific. This is going to create a point of contention with the Chinese, no doubt.
It's important to recognize that these nations have expansive EEZs, and our Coast Guard is limited in the persistent support they can provide.
Need more national
As
security
Secretary of the
cutters.
Navy, have lobbied for the United States Coast Guard budget, if you could believe that.
The amount you get from the Coast Guard for what you invest in it is a huge return. Let me be clear. The U.S. Coast Guard is smaller than the New York City Fire Department in terms of personnel. So you get more bang for your buck. We need more Coast Guard. We need more national security cutters, more offshore patrol cutters. We just do. We just need a lot more air assets, drone. There's no drones in the U.S. Coast Guard. You want to talk about an entity that can use drones? It's the Coast Guard, but they can't afford them.
Through interoperability of our platforms and integrated training of our personnel, our Navy is a critical force multiplier for the Coast Guard. I expect that the demand for this potent Navy Coast Guard combination will only increase as more nations in the Indo-Pacific come to understand their effectiveness. In concert with our Navy and our Coast Guard, our Marine Corps is also supporting our partners and allies in this region. Force Design 2030, the Marine Corps' transformational effort designed to change how they operate and modernize their force, brings them back to the core maritime mission. Through bilateral and multinational exercises, they are joining with our partners to project power from the shore, affecting events at sea by supporting the freedom of maritime maneuver and keeping sea lines of communications open for commerce to freely flow.
I have some issue with what the Marine Corps is doing. I understand they're going back to their amphibious roots. Very good. That was Admiral General Berger. Now you have General Smith. The question is, does the new commandant follow the old commandant? The Marine Corps follows their commandants religiously. But the other issue is the Marines have this idea of just really distributing forces around the island domains and operating them. I just don't know how they keep them resupplied. I know how they want to keep them supplied through these landing ship mediums, these LSMs, which aren't going to be built, I don't think, anytime soon. It's just a concept that needs work. And I don't think right now it's a sustainable idea to drop 75 Marines with some land-based Tomahawks and Navy strike missiles on an island without a way to resupply them.
Our nation's tri-service strategy, titled Advantage at Sea, is a foundational document for maritime statecraft.
So tri-service, that's Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard.
Guiding the integration of our Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard's collective capabilities to better support not just our own national objectives, but again, those of our partners and allies.
It's missing some key components, but
it is now time, and we are committed to updating this strategy to make it more comprehensive with the additional inclusion of MARAD, the Department of Transportation, and NOAA from the Department of Commerce.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Here is a Navy secretary talking about adding the U.S. Maritime Administration and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. MARAD, which operates the Surge Sealift Fleet for the Military Sealift Command and the Transportation Command, and NOAA, which operates the survey vessels that are used in U.S. possessions around the world. I would have loved to hear him say the U.S. Merchant Marine, but I think that's what he means by MARAD. But this is a massive thing, something that I've been advocating for a long time. A lot of people have been advocating this for a long time, is that you have to get away from a naval strategy that looks at purely military, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine, and Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard, and include the commercial element. So this is a huge element for this. I should also mention that the NDA, the National Defense Authorization, last one, put MARAD, the Maritime Administration, to develop a national maritime strategy. They have since contracted with Center of Naval Analysis to begin that process.
As our department charts a new course on how we can best advocate for and integrate ourselves into a more comprehensive national approach to maritime statecraft, we are conducting a deliberate review of how we approach training our strategists. This is so very important throughout our Navy and Marine Corps, and how we utilize them after they graduate from schools like this one. I always say that I expect my admirals and my generals to know how to fight. Of course, you would expect them to know how to fight. They've been trained for 20 to 30 years to do so. But more so, I demand that they actually be strategic thinkers, that they strive first to deter our adversaries and, if called upon, be victorious during times of conflict.
The best use of a military is to never use it. I mean, it's to deter. It's so that you will never get to the point where you have to use a military. I've been a military historian now for 30 years. And I can tell you that's the key is you don't want to fight a war. The problem is we tend to study wars and we don't study what prevents wars, those inner warriors, which are really, really important. Why is it that you don't get struggles during certain periods of time? And a lot of it has to do with not just diplomacy, but the use and threat of military force that's used. I'm going to deter them. I'm not going to go ahead and do this. And it's when it lacks, it's really when it fails, is that when war happens. So really happy to hear Del Toro talking about this.
We also require more rising civilian policymakers to be educated in maritime strategy so that they can better understand how naval power can be effectively employed to achieve our nation's political objectives and economic objectives in both peace and conflict. It is my steadfast belief that we will only be successful in developing a new national approach to maritime statecraft with the support of military and civilian leaders who are well-versed in our nation's maritime history, for the challenges that we face today are eerily similar to the ones that we have faced in the past.
Maritime history. I can't. I'm so excited. I can't keep it in any longer. It's great. It's great stuff. I mean, again, as a maritime historian, it's just right up my alley. You keep going, Secretary of Navy Del Toro.
When I came to this country, the United States stood alone as the world's sole naval power and its preeminent maritime power. With no competitor to challenge the U.S. Navy after World War II, Harvard scholar Samuel Huntington laid out a new rationale for the United States Navy in its seminal 1954 Proceedings article, National Policy in the Transoceanic Navy.
This is a bedrock piece of history that was written at the time.
With command of the seas then no longer in doubt and the rise of a great land power, the Soviet Union, our Navy adopted Huntington's recommendations to focus on projecting power ashore. Ladies and gentlemen, times have changed. The emergence of the first formidable naval and maritime competitor in over 100 years requires new scholarship, policy, and action on integrating comprehensive maritime power into American grand strategy.
Again, been talking about this for a long time, but it's not just me. It's the likes of Bruce Jones in To Rule the Waves. I mean, it's John Conrad over at G Captain. I mentioned Brent Sadler, Jimmy Drennan. I could talk about him, Commander Salamander and Eagle One over at Midrads. I mean, there's been a lot of people talking about this. Brian McGrath, just a huge group of people that have been talking about this. Hunter Stiers. I can go on and on, who have been really pushing this. And what was really interesting is when I went to McMullen Naval History Symposium the other week up at the Naval Academy, I got pulled aside by someone who I trust absolutely implicitly. And he told me that we were making inroads in our discussions, that the things that I was saying and John Conrad and a few others were saying were beginning to be heard by the higher ups. And to tell you the truth, I kind of doubted that because I just thought we were yelling into the chasm, the echo chamber. But listening to Secretary Del Toro's speech here, it seems as if there's starting to be a little bit of traction.
Last year's National Defense Authorization Act finally codified, for the first time in long, a critical mission that John Adams created for the Department of the Navy to organize, train, and equip forces for the peacetime promotion of the national security interest and prosperity of the United States.
My good friend, newly Captain B.J. Armstrong over at the Naval Academy History Department writes about this, these small missions. He's just done a book about the U.S. Navy and the inner war years between World War I and World War II that really emphasizes this issue. Again, another great salient point here.
This act was passed in recognition that we are once again in an intense peacetime competition with a global maritime power, and that the interest and prosperity of our nation are at stake every day. And so we must renew our own commitment as a nation to recapitalizing national maritime power. I ask that you join us in pursuit of this new vision for maritime statecraft in the 21st century, one that addresses a range of emerging challenges such as new shipping routes and resources that are emerging in the Arctic, for example, the race for deep sea mining, control over seafloor communications cables, the vulnerability to U.S. trade that's carried on foreign flags in times of conflict, and so many more challenges and opportunities. Mankind's reliance on the maritime domain is going to accelerate more in the decades to come, and there is still so much we have to learn about the oceans that we increasingly depend upon. In the words of President John F. Kennedy, we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. Your Department of the Navy is at flank speed on this journey, and I ask you to please join us. Thank you.
So that's a really interesting talk there. I'm pleasantly surprised about it. You don't get a lot of high officials that talk on that kind of level, talking about statescraft, and especially on the military side, tends to be platforms and technology and weapons. But Del Toro really hits on some key points right there. Understanding that when you're playing in the maritime domain, it's not just the size of your missile tubes. It is literally your supplies. It's your communications. It's your trade. And understanding that we have fallen behind by there. There was a great prize-winning essay in 1965 in the U.S. Naval Institute by Admiral Hayes. He won the General Prize, where he talked about the fact that we were losing out. This is 1965, 20 years after the end of World War II. He identified that we were missing out on something, that we were allowing our commercial fleet to decline, and that was going to come and literally bite us in the butt in the future. And Admiral Hayes was exactly right. We allowed it to happen. During the 1980s and the 90s, we got delusioned by this. We got sucked into the 600-ship Navy. We allowed our commercial shipping to go overseas, to basically outsource it, which was a way to help the national economy and boost up, because we got really low transportation costs, but at a detriment to the national security. It's one of the reasons why U.S. shipbuilding is in such the state it is today, especially military shipbuilding, because all that's in the shipyards right now is naval shipbuilding. So I think that Del Toro really has a salient call to arms here about this. I'm going to be interested to see what he does. It's great to give a great speech, but now you got to follow up that great speech. What does he do with this? Who does he bring in for this? There's some great talkers about this maritime statecraft. Again, I go back to Brent Sadler at the Heritage Foundation, who literally wrote a book on this. However, I do have qualms with Brent about some of the things he has in there about commercial shipping, because he's not a commercial shipping guy. You need to bring commercial shipping in. You need to bring the shipyards in. You need to bring in the consumers in, the people who use commercial shipping. You need a lot of people to brought in, transportation, commerce, labor, all those elements to come in to create a coherent national maritime strategy. And I'm hoping that what MARAD has been tasked to do to create this national maritime strategy, even though it's going to the center of naval analysis, I'd love for it to go to the center of maritime analysis, but that doesn't exist. It's not just another naval strategy that's coming out that talks about aircraft carriers and submarines and amphibious warships. And oh, by the way, here's this passing little statement here about it. Since the end of World War II, when Samuel Eliot Morison wrote his seminal 15-volume series on the U.S. Navy in World War II, what was left out of that was the Merchant Marine. There was no study about this. I use this analogy all the time. There are 15 volumes written about the U.S. Navy at the end of World War II. There's 5 volumes for the Marine Corps, 5 volumes for the Air Force. There's like 60 something or 70 something volumes in the Green Book series on the U.S. Army. Those are volumes, big, huge, massive books. There's a grand total of 81 pages written for the history of the Merchant Marine in World War II. And that's the problem. That's the problem, is because we didn't appreciate what they did. And I think Del Toro is now realizing, man, we screwed this up and we got to start fixing this, because we are far behind in what the Chinese are doing. They're outbuilding us 260 to 1. we've got to improve that. And the way you do that is by getting commercial shipping back up and running. So a really interesting talk by Secretary Del Toro. Hope you enjoyed my commentary. And if you did, hey, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a big thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. You'll get access to this video early and access to other videos as they come out before everybody else. Until our next video, or until next time Secretary Del Toro gives a great speech and mentions MARAD, this is Sal, signing off.